My husband slapped me in front of his family, claiming he was the man of the house. 5 minutes later, his family watched him packing his things. The sound of his palm against my cheek echoed through the dining room, but it was his smirk that shattered our marriage. 5 minutes. That's all it took to pack 5 years of delusions into a single suitcase. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to thank each of you for being part of this incredible journey. If you're enjoying these stories of empowerment, consider subscribing. It's completely free and helps us build this amazing community. Let's dive in. I'd always known this day would come, though I never imagined it would unfold during his mother's precious Sunday roast dinner. The table was set with her finest china, wedding gifts she'd proudly displayed for 40 years of her own submissive marriage. The irony wasn't lost on me. James stood there, 6 feet 2 inches of entitled arrogance, his chest puffed out like a peacock displaying his dominance. His father nodded approvingly, the same slight nod I'd seen countless times when his son followed in his footsteps of keeping his woman in line. His mother's eyes dropped to her plate, a behavior I'd watched her perfect over decades of similar moments. "I am the man of this house," James declared, his voice carrying that familiar tone of superiority that had slowly poisoned our marriage. "And it's time you remembered your place." The sting on my cheek was nothing compared to the fire burning in my chest. 5 years of calculated submission had led to this moment. 5 years of documenting every controlling comment, every financial decision, every subtle manipulation. 5 years of building my escape route brick by brick while playing the role of the perfect submissive wife. Little did he know I'd already withdrawn half of our joint savings, legally with documented evidence of my contributions. The separate apartment had been rented for months, furnished gradually with cash purchases. My new job offer was secured starting next week at a firm across town. Every detail had been meticulously planned, waiting only for this final act of public humiliation to justify its execution. "You're right, James," I said softly, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. "You are the man of this house." His smirk widened, victory gleaming in his eyes. His sister Caroline shifted uncomfortably in her chair, while his brother Michael suddenly found his roast potatoes fascinating. The familiar dance of family denial was in full swing. I stood up slowly, my napkin placed deliberately beside my barely touched dinner. "Which is why," I continued, walking towards the hallway closet, "you should have this house all to yourself." The confused murmurs around the table grew as I pulled out the pre-packed suitcase I'd planted there earlier that morning. James's face began to transform, the smirk melting into uncertainty. "What do you think you're doing?" he demanded, his voice rising with each word. "Showing you exactly what the man of the house has earned," I replied, wheeling the suitcase to his feet. "Inside you'll find enough clothes for a week, your essential toiletries, and copies of some interesting documents I've been collecting." His father started to rise, but I silenced him with a look that carried 5 years of pent-up defiance. "You might want to stay seated for this part, Richard. It concerns you too." From my purse I withdrew a thick envelope. "This contains records of every joint account transaction where money was diverted to your private account, James. Fascinating pattern, really. Always after my quarterly bonuses cleared. There's also documentation of the consulting fees paid to your father's defunct company, Creative Tax Evasion. I must say." The color drained from both men's faces. Eleanor's hands trembled as she reached for her water glass, while Caroline's eyes widened with a mix of horror and, was that admiration? "You can't prove anything," James sputtered, but his voice lacked conviction. "Actually, I can. My father didn't just teach me to be a good wife, James. He taught me to be a good accountant first. Those skills came in quite handy while building my case over the past 3 years." The silence in the room was deafening. 5 years of careful observation had taught me exactly where to plant each verbal dagger. The perfectly maintained facade of family superiority was cracking, and through those cracks, decades of suppressed truths were beginning to seep. "You have until tomorrow evening to remove the rest of your belongings," I stated, my voice never wavering. "After that, the locks will be changed and the documentation will be sent to the relevant authorities. Unless, of course, you decide to make this difficult." As I turned to leave, Eleanor's quiet voice surprised everyone. "Sarah, where will he go?" I paused at the door, allowing myself one small moment of satisfaction. Perhaps he can stay in the house of the man he learned so much from. After all, isn't that what family's for? The last thing I heard as I walked out was the sound of James's mother beginning to cry, not for her son's misfortune, I suspected, but for the 30 years of her own silence she could never get back. Sometimes the perfect facade needs to shatter for real strength to emerge. As I drove away from the house that had been my prison, I realized that revenge wasn't just about getting even, it was about reclaiming the power that was yours all along. As my car disappeared around the corner from what used to be our home, the weight of what had just happened finally hit me. My hands trembled on the steering wheel and I pulled over, the reality of the past 30 minutes crashing over me like a tidal wave. The stinging on my cheek had faded, but the imprint of his hand felt branded into my skin, not as a mark of shame, but as the final catalyst I'd been waiting for. In the rearview mirror, I could see the slight redness blooming where he'd struck me, a physical manifestation of 5 years of psychological warfare. The family dinner had started like any other Sunday gathering. Eleanor had prepared her signature roast, setting the table with the precision of a woman who'd spent decades perfecting the art of domestic performance. I'd arrived early to help, as expected of the dutiful daughter-in-law, watching her fuss over the placement of every fork and knife. James has been under such pressure at work lately, she'd said as we arranged the flower centerpiece. Men carry such heavy burdens as providers. The same old script, the same justifications she'd probably used for her own husband's behavior all these years. The breaking point hadn't come with the slap. No, it had been building long before his palm met my cheek. It was in the way he'd criticized my choice of wine for dinner. Honestly, Sarah, after 5 years you still can't remember I prefer Cabernet with roast? The slight shake of his father's head, the uncomfortable silence around the table. It was in how he'd interrupted me 3 times when I tried to share news about my recent project at work. Darling, I'm sure nobody wants to hear about spreadsheets during dinner, he'd said, his condescending smile firmly in place. The same smile he'd worn moments before his hand struck my face. The conversation had turned, as it inevitably did, to the roles of men and women in marriage. Richard, James's father, had been expounding on the importance of traditional values, his voice carrying the weight of someone who believed they were sharing universal truths. The problem with modern marriages, he'd declared, swirling his wine with authority, is that women have forgotten the natural order of things. A man must lead his household. I'd made the mistake of disagreeing. Politely, of course, as I'd been trained to do over the years. Actually, I believe partnership and mutual respect. The sound of James's hand slamming on the table had cut through the room like a gunshot. Enough. I won't have my wife contradicting my father in my own home. That's when it happened. The slap that echoed through the room, the culmination of years of suppressed dignity. But what followed was the real breaking point. His smirk. That self-satisfied expression of a man who believed he'd finally put his wife in her proper place. The way his family froze, not in horror at his action, but in anticipation of my expected submission. They'd all expected tears. They'd expected apologies. They'd expected the same pattern they'd witnessed and perpetuated for generations. The woman bowing her head, accepting her correction, perhaps even apologizing for provoking her husband's action. Instead, they got 5 minutes that would shatter their carefully constructed hierarchy. Now, sitting in my car just around the corner, I pulled out my phone. 3 missed calls from Caroline, James's sister. A text message: "I had no idea you were going through this. Do you need anything?" My hands had stopped shaking. In their place, a steady calm had settled over me. The kind of calm that comes with absolute certainty. I thought of Eleanor's face as I'd walked out, the dawning realization in her eyes. Maybe, just maybe, I'd broken more than just my own chains tonight. The breaking point wasn't just about the slap or the smirk, or even the years of subtle degradation. It was about the moment I chose to transform pain into power, humiliation into action, and silence into strength. I started my car again, headed toward my new apartment. In the trunk were the essentials I'd been gradually moving over the past months. Important documents, irreplaceable photos, my grandmother's jewelry. Everything else was replaceable. Everything else was just props in the play I'd been performing. As streetlights flashed past my window, I touched my cheek one last time. The sting had completely faded now, but its impact would reverberate through all our lives forever. Sometimes it takes a breaking point to realize you were never actually broken, just bent into a shape that wasn't yours to hold. The next few hours would be crucial. I knew James well enough to predict his reactions. First disbelief, then anger, then desperate attempts to regain control. But I was done being the supporting actress in his performance of masculinity. The breaking point had shattered more than just our marriage. It had shattered the very foundation of his perceived authority. And as I pulled into the parking lot of my new building, I allowed myself a small smile. The real show was just beginning. As I inserted the key into my new apartment door, memories of the past 3 years' meticulous planning flooded my mind. This wasn't just an escape plan. It was an elaborate chess game where every move had been calculated, every sacrifice measured, and every piece positioned with surgical precision. I walked into the modestly furnished space, so different from the opulent house I'd just left. The furniture here was all mine, purchased piece by piece with cash withdrawn in small amounts over months. Each item represented a step toward freedom, a silent act of rebellion against James's controlling grip on our finances. Opening my laptop, I accessed the secret email account I'd created years ago. Inside were folders of evidence, each meticulously organized and backed up on multiple secure clouds. I clicked through them now, remembering how each piece had come together. Year 1. The first signs were subtle. James's insistence on joint financial decisions that were actually his alone. The way money disappeared from our accounts into his private investments. I'd started documenting everything then, creating spreadsheets tracking every suspicious transaction, every financial manipulation. Being an accountant had its advantages. I knew exactly where to look and what to record. My fingers traced over a particular folder labeled Family Finances. Inside were records of the money laundering scheme between James and his father, consulting fees paid to a defunct company, tax evasion carefully disguised as business losses. I discovered this purely by accident while organizing our tax returns, but it had become the cornerstone of my leverage. Year 2. The psychological documentation began. I'd started keeping audio recordings of our conversations, particularly when he'd had too much to drink and his mask would slip. The verbal abuse, the gaslighting, all carefully time-stamped and archived. There were videos too, seemingly innocent family gatherings where his controlling behavior was on full display, though subtle enough that most wouldn't notice unless they knew what to look for. I opened another folder containing emails from my therapist, documenting our sessions where I'd discussed the emotional abuse. She'd been instrumental in helping me maintain my sanity while building my case, teaching me techniques to appear compliant while secretly strengthening my resolve. Year 3. The physical preparations began. I'd started squirreling away cash, never more than would be noticed missing from our accounts. I'd opened a separate bank account using my office address for correspondence. Every bonus I'd earned had been split, half going into our joint account as expected, half secretly diverted to my escape fund. I clicked through photos of the bruises, not from physical abuse, but from accidents that happened when James was angry. A push door here, a grabbed arm there. All photographed, dated, and witnessed by my doctor, building a pattern that could not be dismissed as coincidence. The most crucial folder contained the recordings of his father's drunken confessions at family gatherings. Richard, so proud of his business acumen, had no idea that his boasting about tax strategies was being carefully documented. The recording from last Christmas was particularly damning. His detailed explanation of how he'd taught James to manage company accounts would be especially interesting to the IRS. Standing up from my laptop, I walked to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of wine. Not James's preferred Cabernet, but my favorite Pinot Noir that I'd never been allowed to buy. The irony wasn't lost on me that while James thought he was controlling every aspect of our lives, I'd been quietly building an arsenal that could destroy him. My phone buzzed again. More messages from his family. I opened Caroline's text. Mom's hysterical. Dad's threatening legal action. Are you sure you want to do this? I smiled, remembering the look on Richard's face when I'd mentioned those consulting fees. He knew as well as I did that legal action would only expose their carefully hidden financial misdeeds. Their threats were as empty as their moral superiority. Opening my journal, the real one, not the decoy I'd left for James to find, I began to write about today's events. This journal, along with its predecessors, documented every step of my preparation, every moment of clarity that had led to tonight's confrontation. These weren't just diary entries. They were a testament to years of silent resistance. The clock struck midnight and I realized I'd been sitting there for hours, surrounded by the evidence of my patient revenge. Tomorrow, James would probably try to access our joint accounts, only to find I'd already withdrawn my legal share. He'd call his lawyer, only to realize that any legal action would trigger the release of documents he couldn't afford to have exposed. I closed my laptop and walked to the window looking out at the city lights. 3 years of preparation had culminated in 5 minutes of perfect execution. 3 years of playing the submissive wife while building the case that would ultimately set me free. The hardest part hadn't been gathering the evidence or setting up the escape plan. The hardest part had been maintaining the facade, smiling at family dinners while recording their incriminating conversations, playing the dutiful wife while documenting every financial transaction, pretending not to see the subtle warning signs while photographing and dating them all. But patience, as they say, is a virtue. And revenge, when served cold after years of careful preparation, tastes all the sweeter for the wait. The morning after my escape brought exactly what I'd anticipated: chaos. By 7 a.m. my phone was flooded with messages, missed calls and voicemails, each one more desperate than the last. I watched them roll in while sipping my morning coffee, feeling strangely detached from the storm I'd unleashed. "Sarah, you're being irrational. Come home and we can discuss this like adults." James, 6:15 a.m. "Do you have any idea what you're doing to this family?" Richard, 6:45 a.m. "Please, darling, let's not make this bigger than it needs to be." Eleanor, 7 a.m. The calculated response I'd prepared was already in motion. My lawyer, Patricia Chin, had been briefed months ago and was ready. At exactly 8 a.m. as planned, she began sending out a series of carefully crafted emails. The first went to James's law firm, detailing the financial discrepancies I'd uncovered. The second to his father's business partners, hinting at irregularities in their consulting arrangements. I replayed yesterday's scene in my mind. Those crucial 5 minutes after the slap. The way I'd maintained perfect composure while retrieving his packed suitcase. The precision with which I'd laid out the evidence. The calculated way I'd revealed just enough to show them I held all the cards without exposing my full hand. The doorbell rang at 9 a.m. Through the peephole I saw James, his appearance disheveled, so unlike his usual polished facade. His tie was crooked, his hair unkempt. The man who'd always insisted on perfect presentation was unraveling, just as I'd predicted. "Sarah," he called through the door. "This is ridiculous. Open the door." I pressed record on my phone, another habit born from years of preparation. "James, step away from the door. Any attempt at forced entry will be reported to the authorities. You can't do this to me. I'm your husband. The man who slapped me in front of his family? That husband." My voice remained steady, controlled. "The security cameras in this building are recording everything, James. Your choice how you want this to look in the divorce proceedings." I heard him punch the wall, another predictable response. James had always resorted to displays of physical aggression when he felt powerless. The difference was, this time it would only strengthen my case. My phone buzzed with a text from Caroline. "He's at your apartment? Dad's furious. He just got a call from his biggest client asking questions about the consulting fees." Everything was falling into place. The dominoes I'd carefully arranged over years were toppling exactly as planned. James's desperate display at my door, Richard's clients asking questions, Eleanor's frantic calls. All of it proved that my calculated response was hitting its marks with precision. Through the door I could hear James's breathing, heavy with frustration. "The passwords have been changed," he said, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "You can't access any of our accounts." I allowed myself a small smile. "Check your email, James. Your father might want to see it too." My lawyer had just sent the documentation showing the new account arrangements. Every joint account had been legally divided, with my share transferred out minutes before I'd left the house yesterday. The thinly veiled tax evasion scheme between father and son was laid out in clear, irrefutable detail. "You had no right," he shouted, his voice cracking. "I had every right. Just like you had the right to be the man of the house, remember?" The security guard I'd alerted earlier appeared at the end of the hallway. "Is there a problem here, ma'am?" "Mr. Crawford was just leaving," I replied loudly enough for James to hear the warning in my voice. I listened to his footsteps retreating, followed by the ding of the elevator. Through my security app I watched him storm out of the building, punching numbers into his phone, presumably calling his father. Within minutes, my phone lit up with a call from Richard. I let it go to voicemail, then played it on speaker. Sarah, you listen to me. Whatever you think you're doing, you're making a terrible mistake. This family has connections you can't imagine. One word from me. I sent a text in response. One word from me to the IRS, Richard. Your choice. The calculated response wasn't just about the evidence I'd gathered or the timing of my escape. It was about understanding their psychological patterns, predicting their reactions, and having countermoves prepared for each one. Every threat they could make had already been anticipated and neutralized. I opened my laptop and sent the final email of my calculated response. To Eleanor. Attached were photos spanning our marriage. Every family dinner where James had belittled me, every holiday where Richard had lectured about a woman's place, every moment where she had sat in silent complicity. The final photo was from yesterday, my cheeks still red from James's slap. Sometimes, I wrote, the strongest thing a woman can do is stop accepting what she's taught to endure. As I closed my laptop, I realized that these 5 minutes of calculated response had achieved what 5 years of silent submission never could. In showing them exactly who I'd become while they thought they were breaking me, I'd shattered not just their control but their entire worldview. The real power didn't lie in the evidence I'd gathered or the threats I could make. It lay in the moment they realized that the submissive wife they thought they'd created had been orchestrating their downfall all along. That first night of true freedom was surreal. As the adrenaline of the day's confrontations finally wore off, I found myself standing in my new bedroom, surrounded by the carefully curated pieces of my new life. The silence was different here. Not the suffocating quiet of walking on eggshells, but the peaceful stillness of sovereignty. My phone had finally stopped its constant buzzing. The last message I'd received was from Eleanor, a simple "I understand" in response to my email. The implied weight of those 2 words hung in the digital space between us. Perhaps she saw her own unrealized potential in my actions, the roads not taken in her own life. The flying monkeys started their assault the next morning. First came the mutual friends, their messages a carefully orchestrated mix of concern and guilt-tripping. James is devastated, Sarah. Couldn't you have handled this differently? Think about his career. This could ruin him. Every couple has rough patches. You're throwing away years of marriage over one mistake. I'd prepared for this too. Each message received the same response. A photo of my bruised cheek followed by, "Would you give this advice to your daughter?" The silence that followed was telling. Then came the family pressure. James's cousins, aunts, uncles, people who'd smiled benignly at his controlling behavior for years, suddenly had very strong opinions about my vindictive actions. Their messages ranged from emotional manipulation to outright threats. But something unexpected happened too. Support emerged from unlikely corners. Caroline, James's sister, showed up at my apartment with a bottle of wine and tears in her eyes. "I've watched him become our father for years," she confessed as we sat on my new couch. "I should have said something. Done something." "You're doing something now," I replied, pouring her another glass. My phone lit up with a text from Michael, James's brother. "The family's in chaos. Dad's lawyers are working overtime. But I want you to know, you did the right thing. Some things need to break to be rebuilt." The most surprising ally emerged in the form of James's young niece, Emma. At 16, she'd started a group chat with her female cousins, sharing the documentation I'd kept of James's behavior as a warning sign checklist. "Aunt Sarah showed us we don't have to accept this as normal," she'd written. The thought of these young women learning to recognize red flags early filled me with a fierce pride. Building a new support system meant being vulnerable in ways I'd forgotten how to be. I reached out to old friends who drifted away during my marriage, expecting rejection but finding open arms instead. "We've been waiting for you to come back to us," my college roommate Lisa said during our first lunch reunion. "We knew the Sarah we loved was still in there somewhere." My therapist, Dr. Martinez, helped me navigate the emotional landscape of freedom. "You're experiencing something unique," she explained during our session. "Most abuse survivors struggle with the aftermath of escape. You're dealing with the aftermath of a perfectly executed liberation. The emotions are different, but they still need processing." He was right. There was guilt, not for leaving but for succeeding where so many others couldn't. There was fear, not of James anymore, but of the ripple effects my actions would have through generations of his family. And there was grief, not for the marriage I'd lost, but for the years I'd spent planning instead of living. Work became my sanctuary. I'd already laid the groundwork for success there, quietly excelling while maintaining the facade of the disinterested corporate wife. Now, unleashed from the requirement to downplay my achievements, I threw myself into projects with renewed vigor. My boss, Sarah Chin, pulled me into her office a week after everything happened. "I always knew you were holding back," she said, sliding a folder across her desk. "We have an opening for department head. The interview is yours if you want it." The position would mean a significant pay raise and, more importantly, a chance to mentor other women in the firm. The irony wasn't lost on me. While James's career was imploding under the weight of exposed financial misdeeds, mine was soaring. Each day brought new challenges but also new victories. I learned to sleep in the middle of the bed, to choose restaurants based solely on my preferences, to laugh without checking if my joy was appropriate to the situation. Small freedoms that felt enormous after years of constraint. The most profound change was in my reflection. The woman in the mirror stood straighter, smiled more freely, looked back at me with clear eyes that no longer carried the shadow of constant calculation. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was flourishing. Late one night, about 2 weeks after my escape, I received an unexpected email from Eleanor. "I filed for divorce today. Richard doesn't know yet. Thank you for showing me it's never too late to start over. Would you meet me for coffee?" As I wrote back accepting her invitation, I realized that the aftermath of my calculated revenge had evolved into something more meaningful than punishment. It had become a beacon, illuminating paths to freedom for others trapped in the same patterns. The woman who'd been slapped at a family dinner was gone. In her place stood someone stronger. Not because of the revenge she'd enacted, but because of the freedom she'd claimed. The aftermath wasn't just about surviving the explosion I'd created. It was about building something beautiful from the ashes. The coffee shop where I met Eleanor was neutral territory, far from both our usual haunts. She looked smaller somehow without Richard's dominating presence beside her. Her hands trembled slightly as she stirred her latte, the diamond ring she'd worn for 40 years noticeably absent. "Richard received the divorce papers this morning," she said quietly. "He threw them at his lawyer and demanded they be fought. Just like James did with yours." The social fallout had begun spreading through our circles like wildfire. The carefully constructed image of the successful father-son business duo was crumbling. Their country club membership had been quietly suspended pending investigations into their financial dealings. Former friends suddenly couldn't remember their phone numbers. The ladies' auxiliary committee called, Eleanor continued, a hint of bitter amusement in her voice. They thought it best if I'd stepped back from organizing the annual charity gala. 40 years of perfect table arrangements, and now I'm a liability. The truth was unraveling their social fabric thread by thread. James's law firm had placed him on indefinite leave while they conducted their own investigation into the financial irregularities I'd exposed. His father's business partners had called for an external audit. Their carefully constructed kingdom was collapsing under the weight of exposed lies. Caroline called me later that day, her voice excited. "Sarah, you won't believe what happened at Dad's office today. The FBI showed up with warrants. Something about suspicious consulting fees and tax evasion. Michael's wife posted it all over Facebook before anyone could stop her. Social media had become the battlefield where reputations lived and died. Screenshots of James's threatening messages to me circulated among our mutual friends. His previous girlfriends began sharing their own stories of controlling behavior. The perfectly curated image he'd maintained was being shredded by the collective power of shared experiences. The country club set. Those pillars of society who'd turned a blind eye to James's behavior for years were now facing their own reckoning. Wives who'd watched me suffer in silence were being forced to confront their complicity. Husbands who'd admired James's traditional values were discovering that their wives were opening separate bank accounts. Margaret Wilson called me today. I told my therapist during our session. Remember her? The one who told me I was lucky to have such a strong-willed husband? She wanted to know if my lawyer would meet with her daughter. The ripple effect was undeniable. Young women in our social circle were scrutinizing their relationships with new eyes. Men were finding their casual misogyny challenged where it had once been accepted. The comfortable assumptions of gender roles that had cushioned our social set were being stripped away. James's attempts to maintain control became increasingly desperate. He showed up at social events uninvited, trying to tell his side of the story. But the evidence I'd gathered spoke louder than his protests. The recording of him bragging about hiding assets from little women who don't understand business was particularly damaging when played at a partners' meeting. Richard's reputation crumbled even faster. His old boys network, once so powerful, proved surprisingly fragile when faced with federal investigation. Former business associates couldn't distance themselves fast enough. The man who'd prided himself on being a pillar of the community was watching that community turn its back. Eleanor's social circle split dramatically. Some friends, themselves trapped in similar marriages, rallied around her with unexpected ferocity. Others, invested in maintaining the status quo, treated her like she was contagious. The women's book club she'd hosted for 20 years suddenly found a new venue. But the most fascinating transformation was happening online. A local women's support group had picked up my story, anonymizing the details but sharing the strategies I'd used to document the abuse and plan my escape. My methodical approach to breaking free became a template for others. "You've started something," Caroline told me over dinner. Mom's divorce announcement gave courage to her friend Patricia. "She left David last week. Took everything she'd learned from your example. Documented everything, planned it all out, just walked away one day while he was at work." The social media storm reached its peak when James made his final mistake. Drunk and angry, he posted a long rant about ungrateful wives and family values on LinkedIn of all places. By morning, his law firm had seen enough. The termination notice cited behavior unbecoming of the firm's values. His father's response was equally self-destructive. Richard's attempts to threaten his way out of the situation only dug the hole deeper. His golf club buddies, once so impressed by his business acumen, now avoided eye contact in the hallways. The emperor had no clothes and everyone could finally admit they'd seen it all along. The most powerful moment came during a charity event I attended with my new department head title. Eleanor was there, her first public appearance since filing for divorce. The whispers followed her until she reached my table. Without hesitation, I stood and hugged her, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I saved you a seat. Here next to me." The message was clear. The old social order, built on suppressed truths and enforced silence, was crumbling. In its place, something new was emerging, a community of women who'd found their voices, men who chose to be allies rather than oppressors, and a social conscience that could no longer be bought with charitable donations and country club memberships. As spring bloomed in the city, so did my new life. 6 months had passed since that fateful Sunday dinner, and the woman who had walked away from her marriage had transformed into someone even she didn't fully recognize, stronger, more vibrant, unbound by the constraints of others' expectations. My promotion to department head came with an office overlooking the city skyline. The view reminded me daily of how far I'd risen from the ashes of my former life. The walls, once bare, now displayed my professional certifications and awards, achievements I'd previously been forced to downplay to avoid overshadowing James's ego. "You've completely revolutionized the department," Sarah Chin, my boss, remarked during our quarterly review. "The mentorship program you started for junior female accountants is exactly what we needed." The board is impressed. The program had been my passion project, born from my own experience. Recognizing financial abuse became a mandatory training module, teaching young professionals to spot the warning signs I'd learned to document. The response was overwhelming. 3 employees had already left abusive relationships after attending the sessions. Therapy with Dr. Martinez shifted from crisis management to personal growth. "You're not just surviving anymore," she observed during one session. "You're thriving. Let's talk about what that means for your future." The word no longer carried the weight of dread it once had. My calendar filled with activities I'd been denied during my marriage. Art classes, salsa dancing, weekend trips with rediscovered friends. Each new experience felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that had been locked away. The healing wasn't just professional and emotional, it was physical too. My body began to remember its own rhythms, free from the constant tension of anticipating criticism. I started taking yoga classes, feeling my spine straighten and strengthen with each session. The woman in my mirror stood taller, smiled more freely, carried herself with a confidence that came from within rather than seeking external validation. Eleanor's transformation paralleled my own. After her divorce was finalized, she enrolled in community college courses, fulfilling a dream Richard had dismissed decades ago. We met weekly for coffee, sharing small victories and supporting each other through the challenging days. I found my old art supplies in the attic, she told me one afternoon, her eyes bright with excitement. Richard hated my painting. Said it was a waste of time. I'm turning his study into my studio. The Phoenix Rising wasn't just about personal achievement. It was about helping others spread their wings too. I started speaking at women's shelters, sharing my story and the practical steps I'd taken to escape. My methodical documentation process became a template, shared through support networks and advocacy groups. Caroline joined me at these sessions, adding her perspective as someone who'd grown up in a household of controlled women. Together, we developed a workshop called Breaking the Cycle, helping others recognize and respond to patterns of financial and emotional abuse. You know what's ironic? Caroline said after one particularly powerful session. James and Dad always preached about family legacy. This is our real legacy, helping other women find their strength. The personal growth extended to my relationships with men. Dating seemed like a foreign concept after years of controlled marriage, but slowly I began to trust my judgment again. I learned to recognize genuine respect, to appreciate men who celebrated rather than stifled my success. My first post-divorce date was with a colleague from another firm, a quiet, thoughtful man who listened more than he spoke. When he asked about my career goals and actually waited for the answer, I realized how low my expectations had been set before. The most unexpected growth came in forgiving myself. Not for leaving. I'd never doubted that decision. But for the years I'd spent planning instead of living. Dr. Martinez helped me see those years differently. Those weren't wasted years, she explained. They were your cocoon phase. Every moment of planning, every document you preserved, every small act of secret resistance. Those were the threads you used to weave your wings. The ultimate test of my growth came when James made one final attempt at reconciliation. He appeared at my office, humbled by his downsized life and tarnished reputation. The old James would have demanded, threatened, controlled. This version asked almost politely if we could talk. I've changed, he claimed, sitting across from my desk. Therapy, anger management. I'm not the same man who, that day at dinner. I studied him calmly, noting the designer suit that didn't quite fit anymore, the slight tremor in his hands. The man who had once seemed so powerful now looked small in my professionally appointed office, surrounded by evidence of my success. I believe you've changed, I replied, my voice steady. But so have I. And this version of me deserves more than an improved version of you. As security escorted him out, I felt the final pieces of my old self fall away. The phoenix doesn't return to the ashes it rose from. It soars forward, stronger for having survived the flames. That evening, standing in my home office, I finally took down the last photo from my marriage. In its place, I hung a painting Eleanor had created, a phoenix in flight, its wings spread wide against a dawn sky. Below it she'd written, "Thank you for teaching me to rise." 1 year to the day after that fateful Sunday dinner, I stood at the podium of the National Conference for Financial Empowerment, preparing to deliver the keynote address. The irony wasn't lost on me. My expertise in documenting financial abuse had transformed from a survival strategy into professional acclaim. Our next speaker, the introducer announced, has revolutionized how we understand and combat financial abuse in relationships. Please welcome Sarah Mitchell, author of Silent Ledgers, Breaking Free from Financial Control. My book, born from the detailed documentation of my own experience, had become a bestseller in the business and self-help categories. Each chapter was a carefully crafted guide, teaching others to recognize and escape the patterns I'd learned to document. The advance alone was more than James's annual salary had been. The sweet revenge wasn't in the success itself. It was in the complete reversal of power. James, now working at a small suburban law firm, had tried to prevent the book's publication. His cease and desist letter sat framed in my home office, a reminder of how far I'd come from the woman who would have once yielded to such threats. During the Q&A session after my speech, a familiar face appeared at the microphone. Eleanor, elegantly dressed in an artist's smock splattered with paint, stood tall as she addressed the crowd. As someone who lived 40 years in financial darkness, she began, her voice clear and strong. How do we help women recognize their worth before it takes decades to break free? The audience didn't know she was my former mother-in-law. They didn't know that her art gallery, showcasing works by survivors of domestic abuse, had just received a major grant. They didn't know that Richard's attempts at reconciliation had been met with restraining orders and public humiliation. My answer was simple: we lead by example. We show them that success isn't measured by the size of their husband's bank account, but by the strength of their own resolve. The revenge grew sweeter with each small victory. James's new girlfriend, having Googled him before their third date, found my TEDx talk about recognizing controlling behaviors. She ended things immediately. Richard's country club membership was permanently revoked when the extent of his financial frauds became public record. But the sweetest revenge came in unexpected forms. The women's shelter where I volunteered named a financial literacy program after me. Former clients from James's law firm began seeking my consulting services on detecting hidden assets in divorces. My methodology for documenting abuse became part of the standard training for domestic violence counselors. Caroline called one evening with news that made me laugh out loud. Dad tried to join the new golf club in Westbrook, she reported. They Googled him and suddenly their membership was full. But guess what? They just invited Mom to showcase her artwork in their main hall. The local newspaper ran a feature story about Eleanor's transformation from country club wife to celebrated artist and advocate. The photos showed her in her studio, surrounded by powerful paintings of women breaking free from various bonds. The reporter noted that her ex-husband declined to comment for the story. James made one final attempt at reasserting control. He showed up at a book signing, waiting in line like any other attendee. When he reached my table, he placed my wedding photo before me instead of my book. "Remember when you were happy?" he asked, loud enough for nearby fans to hear. "Before you became this?" I picked up the photo, studying it briefly. The smile on my past self's face was perfect, practiced, hollow. Looking up at James, I saw what I'd failed to see back then. A small man desperate to feel big. "Would you like me to sign this too?" I asked pleasantly, uncapping my pen. To James, "Thank you for teaching me that the best revenge is living well. Shall I date it?" The whispers and phone cameras around us told me this encounter would soon be viral. James retreated, leaving the photo behind. I added it to my speaking materials. A visual aid for recognizing the difference between a genuine smile and a survival mask. The ultimate revenge wasn't in James's downfall or Richard's disgrace. It wasn't even in my own success. It was in the ripple effect of empowerment spreading through our social circles. Young women who'd once admired my perfect marriage were now attending my workshops on financial independence. Men who'd emulated James's controlling behavior found themselves suddenly single. At the end of my keynote speech, I shared a new initiative, a foundation providing grants to help women escape financial abuse. The first recipient would be announced next month, at a gala hosted in the same country club where James had once held court. Success, I told the audience, isn't about getting even. It's about getting free. And then holding the door open for others to follow. As I left the stage to a standing ovation, my phone buzzed with a text from Eleanor. "Just sold my portrait series, Men Who Would Be Kings. Guess who bought the centerpiece? James's old law firm. They're hanging it in their lobby as a commitment to their new ethical standards." I smiled, remembering the central painting in that series. A man on a throne of paper money, his crown slipping, while women in business suits walked past him, their shadows casting longer than his figure. Sometimes, the sweetest revenge is simply becoming everything they said you couldn't be. 2 years after that life-changing Sunday dinner, I stood in front of my full-length mirror, adjusting the CEO nameplate on my new office door. Not just department head anymore, but Chief Executive Officer of my own financial consulting firm specializing in helping women achieve economic independence. The final victory wasn't marked by a single moment but by the profound realization that I no longer defined myself in relation to James or what had happened. The woman who looked back at me in the mirror wasn't a survivor, wasn't an ex-wife, wasn't even a champion of women's financial independence. Though she was all these things. She was simply and powerfully herself. My phone buzzed with a text from Eleanor. "Just finished my last therapy session. The therapist says I'm ready to write my own book. Would you write the foreword?" Her transformation had been as complete as my own. The timid woman who had spent decades in Richard's shadow now owned one of the most respected galleries in the city, specializing in art therapy and empowerment. Her story had become intertwined with mine in unexpected ways, both of us rising from the same oppressive household to find our own paths. The final piece of victory came in the form of an invitation. The National Association of Women in Finance wanted me to lead a panel on domestic financial abuse. The topic wasn't unusual. I'd done dozens of such panels. But this one was different. Among the attendees would be a group of law students from James's new workplace, required to attend as part of their ethics training. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Caroline asked when I told her. "You don't owe them anything." "It's not about owing," I replied. "It's about showing them that the end of one story can be the beginning of a better one." The day of the panel, I wore the same red dress I'd worn on that fateful Sunday. Not as a reminder of pain, but as a symbol of how far I'd come. The slap that had once stung my cheek had become the catalyst for a movement that had helped hundreds of women find their strength. James was there, sitting in the back row with his students. He'd aged more than 2 years should account for, his hair grayed at the temples, his posture less commanding. Our eyes met briefly as I took the stage, and for the first time I felt nothing. No anger, no fear, no satisfaction in his downfall. He had become irrelevant to my story. "Financial abuse," I began, "isn't just about money. It's about power, control, and the systematic erosion of self-worth. But today we're not here to talk about victimhood. We're here to talk about victory." As I shared my story, our story, I watched the faces in the audience. Young women taking notes with fierce determination. Men shifting uncomfortably as they recognized their own behaviors. And in the back row, James, witnessing the full flowering of the strength he'd tried so hard to suppress. After the panel, a young student approached me, glancing nervously over her shoulder at James. "I'm in a relationship," she whispered. "Everything you described. I never had words for it before." I handed her my card, watching her slip it quickly into her pocket. Another seed of freedom planted, another circle completing itself. That evening I hosted a small dinner party in my penthouse apartment. Eleanor was there, showing off photos of her latest exhibition. Caroline shared news of her promotion to partner at her consulting firm. Even James's niece Emma, now a law student herself, specializing in women's rights, joined us. "Full circle," Eleanor mused, raising her glass. 2 years ago a Sunday dinner tore us apart. Now here we are, stronger for the breaking. The final victory wasn't in the material success, though that was sweet. It wasn't in the professional accolades or the lives we'd helped change. It was in the quiet certainty that we had become exactly who we were meant to be, not in spite of our past, but because we had chosen to transform it into fuel for growth. As my guests left that evening, I stood on my balcony watching the city lights flicker like stars. The woman who had once planned her escape in secret now planned expansions of her enterprise in broad daylight. The voice that had been silenced now reached thousands. The hands that had once trembled now held the reins of her own destiny with steady confidence. My phone buzzed one last time, a message from Dr. Martinez. "Saw your panel today. Remember when you first came to me planning your escape? Look at you now. This isn't just victory, Sarah. This is transcendence." He was right. The final victory wasn't about winning or losing, revenge or redemption. It was about discovering that the person I'd been fighting to become had been there all along, waiting for the courage to emerge. I touched my cheek, remembering the sting of that slap that had set everything in motion. What had seemed like an ending had really been a beginning. In trying to put me in my place, James had inadvertently helped me find it. Not as his wife, not as his victim, but as the architect of my own destiny. The circle was complete. The story had found its true ending, not in the moment I walked away, but in the woman I had become by walking toward myself.